All right, so describe what urbanization is. Detail a few negative effects that stem from the Industrial Revolution. So think of the video we just watched with the Breaker Boys. Okay. Think of what I mentioned yesterday, introduced just with the jungle. Okay, I know this is American history, these terms, but it is relatable to all of these developed countries and these countries that are going through this industrial age, this era, right at the same time. All right, so I'll give you some time to work on that. Yeah, we'll get moving. Yeah, I did. Shh. I'll get Leroy in here to throw some basketballs at your head again, Ozzy. What was up with that yesterday? Oh, yeah. It's like when you back.
Bowman walks at the gym class. He goes, "Shoot it!" I could feel me break it right off the front.
Oh yeah.
That's why I don't play basketball.
Recording quiet. Thank you. Okay. All right. So urbanization.
Welcome.
What does it mean? Urbanization. Urbanization. Here we go. Let's get through this, and I can give you some time to work on your. Oh, Connor. There you go.
Process of turning towns and villages into cities.
Yeah, good job, right? So we talked about this agrarian revolution already with the seed drill. We talked about the field, three-field system, four-field system, and how this rotation of crops is beneficial for the production, right? And how this is going to raise supply of food for Europe and these industrialized areas. So yeah, this is going to stem the industrial revolution. We already talked about that quite a bit. So as these poor farmers are losing their jobs, right, as there's new practices and these wealthy farmers are buying up the land, right, this is prompting them to move elsewhere, to find a new way of life, to migrate to these areas where these factories are starting to pop up. And like I mentioned with these factories, these industries are all located near a source of water, right? A means of transportation, natural transportation. That's why when you see cities are focused along, say, the coastline or along rivers that are suited for transportation. So with that, okay, this migration is called urbanization. These people are flowing from the rural areas and moving into these urban areas, right? Again, where the cities are starting to be created. We already talked about this Bessemer process already, how steel production and plowing for skyscrapers now will emerge. and to build upward, right? You might be limited to the land that you have, so why not build up in the sky? So with that, right, we see changes going on. And early on, especially before you see a lot of these developed skyscrapers and buildings start to pop up in these cities, it was overcrowded, right? So detail a little bit about that. Detail about that. Why go ahead?
I said that there were rooms like smaller than a classroom that were fitting up to 20 people. It's bad, like easy to spread very easily.
Yeah, good job, right? So I talked yesterday about how in apartment buildings, right, you're limited to how much space you actually have, and families will literally live in rooms like this, right? You might have 20 people, 30 people in a room living, trying to live in this limited space. So yeah, when it comes to disease, sickness, that spread pretty quick. It's not like they had septic systems back then either, or let's say sewer, right? And when it came to throwing out the waste, they went buckets and tossed it out in the streets. Also, because you're limited space, it's not like they had parks or playgrounds just yet, right? That was just kind of coming along a little bit later. So where do the kids play? Out in the street where you threw your oh, gross. Okay, so you can see how that works, right? When you're walking place to place, you're going by the streets. Okay, and that is getting on to your shoes,
A little
right? And that is getting on your shoes, right? And then you're walking in your home, and disease, sickness spreads pretty quick. All right, so we talked quite a bit about that already. That's why when it comes to government regulation during this time in the early 1900s, a lot of times we want to keep the government out of things. But when it comes to urbanization, when it comes to this overcrowding, when it comes to these unsafe working conditions, well, maybe they need to step up and set up some policies and regulations, keep people safe and protected. Right, what else did we talk about? I know I introduced it yesterday. So yeah, we talked about the Breaker Boys. You just watched the video on it. Yeah, I think we're good with that, right? Yeah, I like to focus a little bit more on it, especially in American history too, because that's a big part of U.S. development into a more modern society. But same thing, that's occurring all around these European countries. Right? Coal was king for a long period of time, and especially here in central PA. What else? What else did we talk about? So we talked about some muckrakers, right? What's a muckraker? What is a muckraker? Go ahead, Chris.
So journalists who focus on the bad conditions for a lot of people.
Yeah, good job, right? Good job. So the muckraker, we talked about Upton Sinclair, how he spent some time in the meatpacking industry and really understanding how these processes, these procedures work of keeping meat, chopping it up, and watching these people actually package the meat for consumption. And it was disgusting, wasn't it? Yeah, all right. Just from what I was talking about yesterday when it came to the rat problem, when it came to rat poison finding its way in the food that we eat, when it comes to disgusting practices of preserving this food. Well, you'll read more about it today, so I'm not going to dive into it too much. But with the reading, make sure you focus on some of these disturbing, scene and scene practices of the meatpacking industry. And that's going to lead again for more government regulation. I know we're focusing somewhat on American history, but these practices will be applied to European countries as well. It's just a better way to try to solidify the content and understanding of the negative effects that industrialization brings. I showed you two pictures yesterday. What were the two pictures? You remember? It's towards the end of class. One of them was of the, Paul, go ahead.
Say like a picture of what's it, like in a city, like we're all small.
Yeah, the skyline, right? Is that what we're talking about? Yeah, the skyline. And you can see how a lot of this pollution was emitted in the sky because of some of these early means of power generation and operating these factories to power these factories. And in many cases, you wouldn't even see the sun for weeks, months on end. And obviously, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. And even still this day, like I talked about, in some of these countries that are still developing, they're going through this process a little bit later, obviously, than what we see with the United States and Western European countries. They actually have billboards of the sun just to try to keep people remembering, hey, it's out there. Way back behind some of the smog and behind some of the, obviously, the exhaust from these factories. Gross, disgusting. All right, so I think we stopped. We talked about urbanization already, some of the negative effects with the overcrowding. All right, we talked about, okay, this portrait here, just detailing about urbanization early on, the overcrowded living conditions. Again, the kids are all playing out in the street where, ugh, the gross poop and pee thrown out. Ew, it's disturbing. So again, with urbanization, it's overcrowded because it happens so quick. They just didn't have the means of practices to help when it comes to sanitary conditions. All right, that's why when you think of apartment buildings or when you see buildings, they have an occupancy limit. All right, that's just the max number of people they can put, let's say in a building or a room. Back then, there was no such thing. Also, if there's a fire, what happens? Because these houses are all jam packed next to each other. They're all going to burn to the ground, right? They're all going to burn to the ground. So that's going to affect pretty much everybody if, let's say, an accident occurs. All right, so like I said yesterday, I showed you this image of these factories, these skyline, and really this poor emissions, right? This terrible emissions that were happening all throughout the industrial cities, the urban cities throughout the United States and these European countries. All right, talk about poor air quality. Geez, you guys ever get those messages on your phone? Air quality today is clear, it's good. It's terrible. Back then, it was always terrible. So you imagine breathing that in, breathing that in. Again, might not be able to see the sun for weeks on end, months on end because of this heavy production. All right, so in later years, obviously, we've been transitioning away from this type of production. You don't really see that too much in the United States anymore at all because of these environmental regulations. Like I said, in other countries, you still see some of this, like China, okay, like some of these countries in Asia that are going through this development and where manufacturing still occurs as their high means of their economic systems. All right, so here is a quote real quick. Oh, who read this? You guys read a little bit about this guy already, I'm sure. You read some of his work. With who? Mr. Fight, right? Yeah, okay, right before Christmas. Yeah, Christmas Carol. Okay, who wants to read the quote here? Someone, please. Connor, yes, thank you. Thank you, Connor.
It was a town of red brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as it matter stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like a painted face of savage. It was a town of machinery and function, without which interminable servants of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got employed. It had a black canal and a river ran perfect, still smelling dying.
All right, good, good. So he is Charles Dickens here. You guys know all about him with this Christmas Carol. You guys just read a little bit ago, Mr. Fight. But he was talking about industrialization, the effects of it, right? How this was causing a lot of issues to these industrial areas, and how the smog, this dirt, this debris, the emissions were causing a lot of conditions, especially when it came to the eyesight. Okay, looking at some of these buildings that were scattered with this exhaust and some of the effects of the generation sites within the industrial areas, and how a lot of the creeks, a lot of the rivers that flow through some of these urban areas, well, they were also tainted with the effects of industrialization and this emission process that was occurring. So yeah, it was a bleak, terrible, terrible living conditions for these people in the urban areas. So things had to change. They had to, right? And throughout the 1920s in the United States, things start to change and start to progress in a better way and a better method to try to keep people safe and protect them from some of these harsh realities of industrialization. But at first, there were no such regulations. And as depicted here with this quote, I think this really solidifies how the quality of life really was in these urban areas. Can you imagine that? Oh, man. Okay, so poor working conditions, like I mentioned, men were working 12 to 16 hours a day for little pay. And when it came to trying to afford the cost of living, when it came to resources, just putting food on the table, kids had to actually go in and work too. Like I mentioned with some of these breaker boys working in the coal mines, especially in central PA, right? So when it came to just putting food on the table, everybody had to work. All right. So early on, women, yeah, they were residing in the home, but eventually, as industrialization kicked on, and when we get closer to World War I, women will find their way into workplaces as well. Okay, maybe not as labor intensive, more as, let's say, clerks or secretaries or office workers, but in many cases, when it came just affording goods and materials, they had to work. They had to work. We won't see that transition until later after World War II, where women can just kind of work at the home and and try to raise the children a little bit more, and where one income could really help when it came to providing for the family. But in this industrial age, that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case. Everybody had to work. So, one thing to note too is that this caused a lot of disruptions to the family structure. Okay, there's a lot of, well, abuse, assault when it came to this time period because the men working in the coal mines, the factories for long hours, what do you think they want to do after work? Grab a beer with the boys. Yeah. So they spend their money at the bar. And then after they do that, they come home and the wife's like, "Hey, where's the money? We need to afford food on the put food on the table." Well, then you see some unfortunate assault and some beatings there. So that'll cause a big uproar, especially when we get to the United States with alcohol, right? So I'm sure you guys heard of prohibition before, right? Yeah. So in the 1930s, late 1920s, there was a lot of legislation pushing for banning alcohol because it caused a lot of these issues internally in the homes. And a lot of it obviously stemmed from this industrial age because the stress of the work, because of the long working hours, because of the poor conditions, and how people were literally dying because of the unsafe conditions without any regulations. All right, so there you go. So children, women, they would fill the slots too because you could pay them less. These business owners, well, they found their way of making even more money, profiting off of the labor of cheaper labor, obviously, with women and children. All right, so moving on here. Here's some images. There's a breaker boy right on the right-hand side. Just watch the video on that. So that should just kind of open your eyes of what reality was like and how good you have it, right? How good you have it nowadays. And other means of industrialization. So kids working in these factories. Why? Because if there's a jam in one of these mechanisms, they can reach in and grab it and fix it, no problem. They can fit in these tight places where maybe adults can't. And let's say that jam kind of dislodges. Well, there goes the mechanism. There goes the kid's arm. And many of these pictures and images you look of the early industrialization, you see a lot of people missing limbs, missing fingers because how dangerous it was in the workplace. All right, here's a political cartoon. So as you can see here, these businessmen, these robber barons, which you'll talk more about when you get to American history too, they're searching for, obviously, they'll look for, cheaper labor, and children offered that. Eventually, you'll see child labor laws, but that doesn't happen until literally the early 1930s, 1920s. And we all know what hits right around 1930. Yeah, the Great Depression. So without the Great Depression, who knows how long child labor laws actually would have came in effect, when they would have happened, right? Just so happens we go through a depression where these factories shut down, where they're like, you know what? Yeah, children should be educated, not be working in these harsh conditions, as the factories already shut down from the Great Depression. So yeah, I don't know. When you're looking at that, when you're understanding the time period, the era, well, it kind of just showed that business and industries, they kind of ran the show. They're paying off a lot of these politicians, these political figures, and their power was obviously high at the time. All right, so structure. We'll talk more about this tomorrow when it comes to these economic statuses and systems and theories that start to emerge. And with the upper class, you have the rich industrial business owners. So I already mentioned Andrew Carnegie a little bit. Okay, he's going to apply the steelmaking process to Pittsburgh, to Pennsylvania, producing a lot of steel and elevating the United States as the steel production capital of the world. You'll also hear more in a couple of years about J.P. Morgan, how he purchases a lot of different patents at the time and innovators like Edison, like even Carnegie. He buys a steel manufacturing Carnegie Steel, makes it U.S. steel. And you'll hear more about Rockefeller with Standard Oil. Okay, a lot of these business tycoons, these business leaders, these industrial giants kind of take over. And they're ahead of the game when it comes to this innovation, but it's all on the labor of the lower class, the middle class. So you guys will hear more about that soon enough. But again, that kind of leads into these negative effects of the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. Upper middle class, you got your professionals like the doctors and lawyers. Lower middle class, you got your teachers, shop owners, office workers, and working in some of these less stressful situations or factory type work and type of work. So really labor intensive, not labor intensive at all. Working class, you got your factory workers. So these people are filling the lines in the industries and the factories, working on the assembly lines, producing goods and materials, and even in the coal mines. All right, so this class structure is going to lead to a lot of changes and a lot of activist movements leading for better pay, better compensation, and safer working conditions. All right, so impact on women. So middle class women enjoy more economic opportunities, greater access to education. So a lot of that won't happen until after World War One, especially when it came to the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment, what is it? What is it? 19th Amendment? Anybody? Uh-oh. 19th Amendment. Someone. Why? You know it? Yeah, women's suffrage. Good, good. Again, won't happen until after World War One. So we'll talk more about that when we get to it. And like I mentioned, it's leaking into American history. It is what it is. Working class women separated from families because they're filling into these office positions, these secretary positions. In some cases, when we get to World War One, in the factories to producing goods and materials for the war effort. And obviously, that separation from the children, from the family, could cause a lot of stress to the family structure. Found jobs more people couldn't afford to hire them. Obviously, when it comes to little pay, lower pay than what you have to pay, let's say, a man, and some are no improvement to status. So yeah, the American dream of coming up with an innovation and moving on and moving up that social ladder, that economic ladder, for many people, it never happened. All right, so real quick, I just want to make sure you get time to work on your assignment. All right, so here's some just images of some of urbanization, women working, children working in this domestic system before this factory system comes around. Here's another look. Okay. So yeah, some poor quality of living, jam-packed in some of these areas and these apartment buildings. Pretty sad to see. All right, last thing I want to mention is the jungle. So you'll read about this today, right? So I'll give you some time here, 6 minutes to work on your assignment, the jungle. All right, it shouldn't take you too long to complete. Oh, that line's like a broken record, I guess, too. But anyway, with muckrakers, real quick, what is a muckraker? Chris said it earlier. Someone. Connor, go ahead. Yeah, good job, right? So they're exposing some of the harsh conditions, the unsanitary conditions. And in this case, with Upton Sinclair, he talked quite a bit about the meatpacking industry. So I know we're leading into American history, but it kind of all goes together with these European countries as they're transitioning to this industrial state and how this growing pains occur through this progressive era. So yeah, it's kind of going all hand in hand. But with the jungle, one thing to note is that it talked about the unsanitary conditions, the poor working conditions in the meatpacking industry as urbanization was taking off, as this industrial revolution was occurring. All right, so you'll read about that here now. We'll go to modules. Sooner or later. There we go. Okay, so here's the video lesson for today, the 11th, obviously, and then you have the assignment, the jungle. So what we're going to do is just read through, I think it's just 2 paragraphs, really, that's it, and answer the questions that are listed below. All right, more than 2 paragraphs, but 2 sections. There you go. There's your questions that are listed. Okay. Again, I think you'll find it interesting that how this food and especially when it comes to meat packing industry, how it was pretty disgusting during these times and things needed to change, leading to the Meat Inspection Act that occurs in the early 1900s in America, thanks to these muckrakers. Okay. All right. So I'll publish that. Make sure you have it ready to go. All right, good. There it is. All right, so we'll review this tomorrow. We'll go over it, but make sure you have it done for tomorrow so that you can help with the participation with this discussion. And then we'll play a video for you about the jungle. I think you guys will enjoy it as you can put some of these images in your mind of what it was actually like working in these meat packing plants.
You said 2 paragraphs.